Have you struggled to make human milk feeding work for you? Do you feel constantly pulled between your family or work obligations and producing milk for your baby? As a perinatal support professional, do your clients cry on your shoulders about this tension? Today, you will hear a story of what my guest Jess called a breastfeeding buffet. 3 totally unique experiences with a common thread. A busy working mom making decisions that were best holistically for her family and for her whole self. And often, that meant deciding not to feed human milk and being okay with it. I hope if you are struggling with this, Jess's story will inspire you to make decisions with confidence. If you know someone who could use an infusion of Jess's peace in their own decision-making, send them this story. Then join the Milk Making Minutes community group so that we can all find peace about the decisions that we make or have made for our babies. And I just want to take a minute to say that I posted on Instagram a map of all the places where people are listening. And if you come from one of these places outside of the United States, I'm so happy to hear that you are listening, because these cultural and societal barriers that make feeding our babies human milk are not isolated to the United States. So the top place where people are listening outside of the United States is Australia. And the top city within the United States where people are listening is Seattle. So whether you come from Australia or from Germany, I've seen some listeners there, or from Malaysia, I'm seeing numbers rise in Malaysia, I would love to see you do one of 2 things. Write a review, and in your review say, hey, I'm one of your Australian listeners, or hey, I'm from Seattle, or join my Milk Making Minutes community group, where we are seeking to discuss the barriers that make human milk feeding so challenging so that it does not remain that way. I'll see you there. And until then, enjoy this beautiful story. When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. I may have thought I was prepared, but having known only a handful of people who had ever breastfed and only seeing it up close from a couple of them, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I've become a doula, a lactation consultant, and a childbirth educator. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh, and I welcome you to the Milk Making Minutes, where we explore breastfeeding experiences through the lens of systemic barriers, so that you know your breastfeeding struggles are not your fault, and your triumphs really are the miracles you feel they are. Hi, Jess. Welcome to the Milk Making Minutes. I'm so glad you're here.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So start out by telling us about yourself and your family, however much you want to share.
So I have 3 children, 5, 3, and almost 17 months. And as we'll talk a little bit about in the podcast today, each child has been very different for me, and they're all their own little unique people. So it's always been a ton of opportunity for me to learn. But I love being a mom. I love getting to support them in all of their unique ways. And I love learning about this very special time in families' lives. I loved it so much that I decided to go on and pursue work as a postpartum doula and now a certified pediatric sleep consultant. So not only do I get to draw on my own experiences, but I also get to help support many families who are working through very similar challenges.
Amazing. Yeah, I love that you said they're all so unique, because what I have found is that had I known what my children's personalities were going to be like, they're 9 and 5 now, and had I known that many of the things I was stressing about when they were babies were just a part of their personalities,
Yes. Oh my
I
gosh,
would not have
right?
stressed as much, especially when it came to things like sleep and
Yes.
just disposition. I have one child who is neurodivergent and has some sensory needs. And so sleep still is at 9 years old, a struggle for him. And if I had known that when he was an infant, I would not have stressed about sleep as much as I did.
Yep, my firstborn also has some sensory challenges, and, like, he was my hardest, still is my most challenging, and also anytime it's your first child, it's the hardest because you just don't know what you don't know, and yes, but you look back on it and you're like, "Oh, okay, no, now I get it."
Yeah,
But you
it's
don't get the handbook when they're born, so
no, yeah, we're all just learning as we go. Yeah.
Totally, totally.
Okay, so I'm gonna take you back to before you had all this knowledge that you have now and before you were 3 children in,
Yep.
and I'm actually gonna take you all the way back to maybe your childhood, your teenage years, and ask you what your exposure to baby feeding was
Mhm.
before you were thinking about starting your family.
That is really interesting. So, I am the youngest of my immediate family, and I am the youngest on my dad's side of extended cousins. There were probably like 10 of us. I never was around babies as a kid. I was used to being the little kid. And I know my mother's story with birth and challenges that they had. I know that by the time they had me, I she always framed it like you were a very kind of demanding baby and you were constantly hungry and I just couldn't produce enough. She always can tell now in hindsight, I think she felt a lot of guilt about this, like that she had
Mm,
done something wrong that she couldn't satisfy her baby, who I was a rather large baby, and I guess I did have very, big feeding needs. And so I think they switched over to formula pretty early on. And I don't remember seeing like cousins who had babies. I don't remember seeing breastfeeding. I don't remember seeing much of that. I grew up Catholic, and so we would go to mass on Sundays. And I remember seeing some moms in the back and with a cloth over them. And I was younger, probably that was just what the baby needed to sleep. Didn't even know what was going on underneath that piece of material. So this was definitely not something that I grew up around and was very much exposed to or knowledgeable about.
isn't that interesting to think about being a child and seeing a baby underneath a cloth and not connecting that feeding from a breast
Yeah.
or
Nope.
feeding from the chest? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess it just wasn't, not only was it not really relevant to our present day, like we just didn't have babies around our area, or even, I feel like even a lot of my parents' friends had kids that were older than me. So I was like the baby. And yeah, just didn't ever bring it up. So
Yeah.
it just didn't enter my mind. But I loved babies. I'm like a lot of little girls, like maybe you have a doll when you're a little one. I remember having a little bassinet. I had a little changing table. I understood that babies needed a bottle. So I got that from somewhere. I understood that they needed to sleep. So I got that from somewhere, but nobody ever showed me these things. I just probably picked them up from movies or yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. So fascinating.
Yeah.
And then so then now you're entering adulthood and you're thinking about starting your family. Did you have any friends who fed babies from their bodies before it was your turn?
The most, like, close example that I got to see was my sister, who's 5 years older than me. She had her son, who's now 13, and I they were in Chicago at the time, and so I got the opportunity to go and live in Chicago for that first year. So I was right there, right when he was born, and got to be with him until he turned close to 1. So I got to that was really the first time, and this would put me at 25. Yeah, 25.
Okay.
So I was out of undergrad, and this was my first experience getting to work with a newborn. I did a lot of babysitting as a child, as a younger person. I actually even
Mhm.
had a little babysitting business in like middle school and high school, but those kids weren't newborns. So this was my first newborn experience, and I watched my sister be very committed to breastfeeding, and I watched her struggle. I watched her struggle a lot with, similar to what my mom would talk about, supply, having a baby that was larger and just never was fully satiated. I watched her struggle with how to navigate breastfeeding while being a freelance musician. We actually both are trained musicians, and I remember her having a pretty big gig, like 8 weeks postpartum, to go sing opera on stage. And if you're a professional singer and you're doing like a performance like opera, you're there for an extended period of time, and those rehearsals are really long, and they're not necessarily very conducive to pumping schedules or breastfeeding schedules. I witnessed all of this and I watched this be really challenging. And I think it imprinted in me, as well as the words of my mom, breastfeeding is probably hard. Like, maybe it's easy on paper, but in practice, it seems like it's really hard. So I think that going into my own then experiences with feeding my babies, in hindsight, there's a part of me, I think that those formative impressions made me steer away from learning more. So I didn't necessarily set myself up from with baby one as well as I could have. And now being a postpartum doula, I always say to my clients, especially if I talk to them beforehand, if you think you want to breastfeed, contact these lactation consultants now. Get to know them now, get them on your radar, because you might not have a problem, but you might have struggle, and you just want to be proactive about that if that's important to you. And in my experience with my first child, I think I saw an LC at the hospital for a couple of days and continued to have supply issues and discomfort, and just went back into that headspace of, remember, it's hard. Like, it's hard for the women in our family. Everybody seemed to struggle. Maybe you should just kind of let this go. So I didn't take that proactive step first time around.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting how those early formative experiences can subconsciously guide the decisions that we make.
Yes, I think that's very true. Especially, you definitely made me have to go back into my memory about what my impressions of it were in childhood, and the fact that there isn't really much definitely tells me that, like, I needed to do a lot more work beforehand if I was really going to be committed to it.
Yeah, this is one of the cultural barriers
Yeah.
to feeding babies from our bodies is that we're just not exposed to it. We don't see it. And so then when it becomes our turn, the struggle is much greater.
Absolutely, and if your only basis for it is seeing somebody struggle, then
Yeah,
you might be inclined to have the impression that I had, which is, must be hard because 'cause you're struggling.
right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so you take a breastfeeding class or anything at the hospital before
No,
your first? Okay.
but I prepped so well for my birth. I was very committed to my birth experience. I had largely the births that I wanted, but nope, I was not good about postpartum preparation at all. I remember the postpartum nurse handed me my son Will, my eldest, and said, "Okay, he's gonna feed every 1.5 to 2 hours." And I was like, "Oh." I just went through 36 hours of labor. Do I really? I thought I could get a nice sleep in and then we could start this breastfeeding thing like tomorrow.
Are
I
you
was really
sure about
I
this?
was like, that can't be right. I was really clueless.
Yeah, yeah. So, knowing that this is not a birth-centered podcast and we wanna focus on the feeding, also knowing that birth experiences do have an impact
Mhm.
on milk production, on breastfeeding experiences. Was there anything about that first birth in particular, because 'cause we're talking about that one right now, that you think impacted your early feeding experiences and then your milk supply down the line?
I might have felt a little overconfident. I largely ended up I wanted a vaginal birth. I wanted an unmedicated vaginal birth. I got that the first time around. I didn't have any major complications. And maybe a part of me was like, I could do that. I could figure the next step out.
Mm,
And that was a little misguided. When also, like, my baby, my son he was jaundice. So we're talking like 2 or 3 days after he was born and discharged. And we go to our first pediatrician appointment. And that pediatrician says, you should probably start supplementing with formula. And I listened to her because we wanted to get him in a better place. But that also could have been a time where I could have reached out to a lactation consultant. And that just didn't cross my mind. I think the thoughts of, be prepared for this to not go great, because maybe we just don't feed our babies in our lineage very much.
yeah, absolutely. And the fact that the pediatrician said that the solution for jaundice was formula when there's a lot of evidence to indicate that lots of skin to skin time and human milk, it actually treats jaundice
Mhm.
more effectively is interesting. We
Yeah,
know that lots of calories during jaundice is good, but if there is good milk transfer. So you're right that if a pediatrician says we need to get your baby fed and make sure that there's good milk transfer, would you like to start formula supplementation, or would you like a referral to a lactation consultant who can help make sure that feeding is going well? That would be a much better way to have that conversation if somebody is feeding their baby from their body.
definitely. And the pediatrician I remember was very nice about it. I remember her being like, "We're probably going to have to do this." And I think she was afraid it was Cambridge, and she probably was used to a lot of moms in Cambridge being very committed to breastfeeding. But you're right. There wasn't there are two ways we can go about this.
Mm.
This is what we have to do. And I didn't challenge her on it because I didn't know to.
Right, exactly. Yeah, yeah. This white coat is telling you what to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So did you get immediate skin to skin afterwards, and did feeding start right away? Were you feeling any pain during those initial feedings?
Yes. So he needed to go to the special care nursery for an hour. So I didn't get the immediate skin to skin, but he was definitely with me the first night. I knew that skin to skin was important. So I did do some of it. And obviously, we missed that first hour of it. And I think the whole motherhood moment of your birth of your child, I might have thought I was going to have a stronger feeling towards him in the beginning. And I was more just so exhausted and was like, yeah, I know we'll do this. But I wasn't like excited about it,
Yeah.
wasn't
Yeah.
moved by it. It all just felt foreign to me. And we did, I remember the postpartum nurses were coming and helping me try to get connected with breastfeeding. And they told me that this thing called colostrum is going to come through your breast first. And I didn't know that. And I felt this pain coming down, like in the breast tissue, especially on one side. And I felt this with every child that I had breastfeeding with. And it was really just in the first couple of weeks. But when it's the first time you're ever experiencing this, you're like, this is bad. This is like a sharp pain. This isn't normal. It shouldn't be like this. So even in the hospital, I think I was like, again, this is hard and this hurts. I didn't have latch issues, thankfully, but I just felt that pain
Yeah, you
when
could
my
really
latch.
feel your milk release strongly.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Okay, that's interesting. And so then you get home, you discover the jaundice a few days later,
Mhm.
and then how long was the jaundice concern? Do you remember?
First week, we actually had to go to the pediatrician every day for the first week to do check ins. He never had to get to the point of light therapy, but basically, that was the formula that we did, the little 2 ounces of formula, became more and more what I was drawn towards and less of breastfeeding. I did continue to breastfeed, but it was by no means exclusive, even from that first week. Yeah.
Okay. And how did you feel about that? Did you feel okay with switching to the formula? Did you have a feelings of loss about not breastfeeding, or did it feel more of a relief to you to be able to switch?
I think both. I think both. I think that part of me felt like my pride was being hit. I just had this great heroic birth, and then I couldn't even get last a week with breastfeeding.
Mm,
And so I think I felt some shame there. I When I had my son Will, it was 2017. So I remember the breast is best posters in my OB appointments or midwife appointments and in the postpartum ward. And I didn't see those actually from my last son's birth in 2021. So I think we've moved away from some of that language, but that breast is best really stuck in my mind, and but not from a not as a place to inspire me, more as a place to feel like you didn't measure up, you're not doing the best because breast is best and you're not doing that anymore.
mm,
Felt some conflict there, and yeah, struggled with that. But like I said, I didn't really do my work ahead of time to work through that. And I know now as a postpartum doula, like the best indicator of a breastfeeding relationship is support. So when you get that support in the form of a lactation consultant or a doula and family, like and your pediatrician, when you've got many voices saying, we can work this solution out and you can continue to prioritize your breastfeeding relationship, it's very doable. But
Yeah, even if you are supplementing in some way,
oh,
it doesn't
sure.
have to be one or the other. It can be
No.
both.
And
Yeah.
I tell that to
Mhm.
my clients too, like when they are working with the supplementation, and I'll say, just know that you don't have to go this whole route of formula from now on if you don't want. This plenty of moms will supplement for a while and their supply comes up to a higher level and you don't need this anymore. You can wean off of the formula
Mm,
if you want. So, that there's because of course there's always many solutions to a problem, really.
exactly. Yeah, that idea of I couldn't even last a week, I think that will resonate so strongly with so many people because so many times people feel like they failed.
Yes.
Their body failed them. They failed. They didn't get the trophy.
Yep.
And breastfeeding is a struggle, not because of individual failures. It's a struggle because of so many cultural and systemic failures.
Yes.
And did you even know of the idea of a private practice lactation consultant?
I think my doula had mentioned it, but I think cost was a barrier at the time.
Mhm.
My husband and I were both on like individual insurance plans, and lactation visits weren't covered by insurance, and
Mhm.
things felt very expensive. I was a performer at the time. I had no paid I never had paid leave really, but I really didn't have paid leave that first time and just felt, we don't really have the money for this,
Right.
you know?
Yeah. And did anyone point you to any free support groups, Breastfeeding USA or La Leche League or anything like that where you could get some peer
I knew
support
that
help?
yeah, and I knew that there was, like, a drop-in breastfeeding led by an LC, I think, at the Cambridge Birth Center, which is where I labored and then had my birth at the Cambridge Hospital. So I knew I could go back to the birth center, and again, I think I just started to put the wall up.
Yeah. Yeah. How long did you continue some form of feeding from the body in addition to the formula?
So I kept that really until I'd say 2 to 3 months. I think I had my first performance 3 months postpartum. I had a solo gig. So this was my son was born in September, and December was my first gig. And I had been thinking about, um, what am I going to do? Because performance gigs are just not conducive to breastfeeding or parents of any kind. You have long rehearsals and there's not a place to safely breastfeed. And so I was relieved that I didn't have to worry about pumping or figuring out how my childcare was going to work to have my baby. And so by the time that gig came, I think I was so low on breastfeeding that point. I think I would go sometimes a couple days not breastfeeding that I was like, I think if I just stop at this point, it's not going to be a problem. And that was true. I didn't have any, I never had mastitis. I never had any complications. I was engorged in the beginning, but it didn't last for very long. So, yeah. And that was true for all three of my breastfeeding experiences. I never had gotten to a point where I had those kinds of complications.
So it seems like it was so gradual, dropping feedings along the way as life got busier, that
Yes.
by the time you were at the end, you could just decide to stop.
Just stopped. Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And your baby was fine navigating both bottle and breast. He
Yep.
seemed to be fine doing either one.
Yeah, all 3 of mine actually were good with bottle. Each had different preferences for temperature, but and there wasn't ever breast strike after being introduced to the bottle for any of my kids. I think each of them would have breastfed longer. I think it was more me that said, "I'm done."
Yeah, great. Okay. Yeah, and I'm so happy you're bringing up this barrier of having a work life that isn't really conducive to being able to take pumping breaks or were you in costumes during rehearsals?
So my work was more concert work. I didn't
Okay.
have to do costumes and my gigs would be like a week at a time. And at that point I stopped traveling. Although I did take a couple gigs out of town where I brought my son, which was hard. But most of these gigs were local in Boston, and but they would be 4-hour rehearsals plus a half an hour or an hour to get there, an hour to get back. And I was also private teaching in the Boston area as well, going into families' homes. So I really didn't have a place other than maybe my car to pump in between these lessons, and I would be there 5, 6 hours a day. No, my situation was not easy to really find those accommodations. I didn't have any federal protections for workplace because I was always a 1099 contractor. And I just, unless families felt out of the goodness of their heart, and many said, if you ever want to come and pump here, that's totally fine. But I also just didn't have the time because it would mean I wouldn't get home until 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. And then my baby's not sleeping and I just couldn't handle it. So
Right.
it was too hard
So
how to
you
fit
were
that in.
choosing between taking that time to pump or taking that time to see your baby and help your baby be on a good schedule. Yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then what
Mm.
if you had decided to try to pump when you were doing concerts, who was it that you would have even asked for that accommodation?
Usually, you're hired by a conductor who maybe has an operations person. So, if there's an operations person, then you would request that. And I do advise and work with colleagues of mine who are still performing musicians. I've since retired, but who are now parents navigating that. And it can be negotiated at the point of contract, even though it's not something that they are required to provide because they do not have to. Many organizations are wanting to work more on their sort of family inclusivity. And depending on what venue is that you're rehearsing in, many of my venues were churches. Maybe you would get maybe a conference room, but more likely the like child area in the
Mm,
basement, or maybe like a little room off
like a
the
Sunday school
sanctuary.
room or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe it had a plug, maybe it didn't. So we're not talking like a milking mother's room, nothing like that.
Yeah. Wow. That's an interesting barrier. I can
Yeah.
imagine that if one person walks away in the middle of the rehearsal, can they continue to rehearse? Or
Not if you have a pretty big part, and a lot of the music that I do, it's one on a part. So, yeah, people need you there. A lot of time, how that industry, a lot of people make it work is like they have somebody with their child on site. And so, maybe they get the opportunity to go and do an extra feed
mhm.
if they're not called in that moment for that lumber. Although I remember, this is not a podcast about that, but I remember being lectured for being late because I was basically finishing feeding my baby and was helping him to settle so my mom could be with him so I could go to my rehearsal, and I got lectured for not being on time. It really wasn't a very encouraging place to be a parent.
While we have made great strides, we still have such a long way to go when it comes to workplaces being more inclusive to parents who are feeding their babies human milk. There are so many people who fall through the gaps, and this takes a multi pronged approach. We need longer parental leaves and leaves for all workers, including contracted workers, so that parents making milk don't have to choose between milk making and work if they don't want to. And we also need employers to be more educated about the physiology of milk making. We have to stop pretending that milk making is just women's business. It's not. We are mammals. This is a human endeavor. And if more employers understand why we need to protect time to pump by understanding the physiology of milk making and the autocrine control of milk supply, then we may see more compassion and understanding towards those who need to pump. If you or someone you know holds a position of power at a workplace, I can be hired to speak to your HR team, your hiring managers, and others who create workplace policy about why protecting this time really matters. Reach out to me at low@quabenburstservices.com. Yeah, that sounds really challenging.
It is. Yeah.
Okay, so you did a combination of formula and breastfeeding until about 3 months when you finally said, "Okay, I'm done
Yeah.
with this." And then I know your second experience was way different.
Way different.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So tell us about this experience.
So this is my now 4-year-old who is a feisty, thriving little girl. You'd never know her incredible story into the world. But at 28 weeks, my water broke. And 4 days later, she was born at 2.5 pounds. So we had a very different pregnancy and birth than we had for the first one. My first was natural, crunchy as much as I could get it. And the second one was still a vaginal birth without medication, although your body doesn't really need to go through a lot of labor when you're birthing a 2.5 pound baby. So this was at MGH, and we were very fortunate to be right at MGH. And so she could go right to their NICU.
This
And
is Mass General Hospital
oh,
for
yes,
people outside of Boston.
thank you. Yes, Mass
Uh,
General Hospital in Boston. And she just basically stayed there for 2 months.
wow.
Yeah. And one of the first things you learn when you are a NICU parent is that your breast milk, especially when they're that young, when they're very premature, breast milk is always beneficial to your baby, however much you can give them, but it's especially beneficial when they're premature. And it also is going to require you to use a pretty strong pump in order for you to get the amount that you need consistently, because your baby is not going to be able to even begin to work on feeding from the breast until several weeks later. Usually, I think she started working on breastfeeding maybe around 34 weeks or so,
Mm,
6 weeks later. So that
hmm.
first 6 weeks, they said to me, like, here's a Medela Symphony pump, and you can try to get as many of these vials as you can, bring them in. We'll feed these through her NG tube, through her nose, and this is what she will have as long as we can give it to her. And I had a 2-year-old at home, and that was just a very difficult time, traumatic and stressful in so many ways. My family felt like it was falling apart. And you're on a pumping schedule where you're trying to pump every 2 to 3 hours, connected to a wall, managing a 2-year-old, trying to get down to Boston. We live in the Natick area, which is 30 minutes outside of Boston. It was so hard. It was so hard. But that time around, I said to myself, like, she needs this. I don't know if I can do this all going forward, but I'm going to at least make this be my goal. While she's in the NICU, she will have my breast milk. And I was able to meet that goal.
That's amazing. And I love that idea of just starting out with a small goal. You don't have to have, a years long goal. And you knew how important it was for your preemie. It really is so critical for them to have that breast milk, if at all possible. Now, people who aren't able to do that, I'm so glad that we have other ways of feeding those babies, because sometimes going through the pumping rigmarole takes a huge toll on the parent who has to do that, especially as you're mentioning, if there are other children at home, or if you're far away from the hospital, or if you have to go back to work right away. Because when you have a baby so early, sometimes your leave does not cover the amount of time that your baby even needs to be in the NICU,
That's right. That's right.
depending on how long they have to stay.
Yes.
If you have leave at all. As you mentioned, you didn't even really have an official leave.
And I didn't have leave that second time either. So
Mhm.
I had to create my own leave. But I, at that point, was doing less performing and more teaching. And I had pockets of teaching in different parts around the area. So I shut down certain studios and kept the ones that were close to MGH. So I actually
Mm.
had a pretty big studio in Charlestown, which was only maybe 10 minutes over the bridge. And that I said, I'm basically going down part time, and I'm going to go in and see my baby and go teach, or go teach and then come back around and see my baby. So I would just make that one big trip in my day.
I can understand why you would need to continue to teach it financially, but the fact that you were able to even fathom doing that mentally and
It was
physically
it was
is
so hard. It was so hard, and yet the teaching that I did was for piano and voice, and they were mostly children, and I had great relationships with those parents. Every time I would go to their house, they would ask me how I'm doing. They would feed me, they would
mm,
gifts, they would share their stories of friends who had NICU babies who were doing so well right now. I think I needed them. I think I needed that
mm,
community at that time, to help me see that this was a blip on the radar and we're going to move through it and it's going to be okay. And yes, I needed to continue to work because I still wanted to take some time off once she was finally home. And because she was in the NICU for 2 months and then I wanted to take 2 months off at home, I really had 4 months all of a sudden. And this was before the paid family leave was passed. So that wasn't an option, although that did become an option for me with my third, which is how I finally got some paid leave on my third
Hmm.
maternity leave.
And that's here in Massachusetts. A state law was passed that
Yes.
allowed everyone here in Massachusetts to take some amount of family leave.
Yeah.
Wow. And I thank you for sharing that because I think there's a certain amount of guilt that comes with families. I've heard this a lot when there is a baby in the NICU and the family, for whatever reason, is not able to stay at the NICU all day, every day. Well, because some NICU families, they are able to stay all day, every day for as long as they can with their babies, but that's just not the reality for everybody.
It was not for me at all. And bless those NICU nurses at MGH because never once did they say to me, you need to be here more or you're not doing enough. They completely understood. They were so empathetic and they made me feel like truly she is in the place she needs to be with the people that she needs to be with right now. Eventually, she'll
Mm,
be able to come home and I'll be able to snuggle her. But in my mind, she was this science baby. And I was like, and I don't know how to
mm,
handle a science baby. These people know what she needs at this stage. I don't
mm.
know. I couldn't keep her alive. So I think I just was able to really put that on the NICU team and not go there. And there were days where I wasn't able to get back. I think the longest stretch I went was 5 days where I couldn't be
Mm,
there. But I can say
yeah,
now she's 4 years old. Her attachment to us is so strong. She's such
yeah,
a resilient little girl. She's
mm,
so happy. She's tiny and so mighty. And so I'm when I hear families worry about, oh, I'm not doing enough, I'm not doing this, that, I remember, I'm like, you know what? Kids are resilient, they're amazing, and you just love on them when you can, how you can. It'll be enough.
right. So what was it like transferring your milk back and forth to the hospital?
It was hard. It was really hard. Usually, I would come in to Boston, drop it off at the nurses, then I would leave the hospital again and go teach in Charlestown. Then I would come back and pump there and, spend time with her, do kangaroo time. That was hard doing that but manageable enough. I did it and the
Yeah.
Symphony pump was a great pump. So
And you were able to use the symphony that they provided at the hospital at home as well?
I was able to rent one through my insurance for
Okay.
a year, covered
Okay.
in full. So I was
Okay.
super lucky that I was able to have one. At this point, my husband became a state employee, so we were on a much better insurance plan. Had this been our first birth when we were on our individual plans, I don't know if I would have gotten quite as good of a pump to have.
Okay. All right. And did anyone walk you through some great techniques for exclusive pumping, help you figure out your schedule, help you figure out some hands-on techniques for pumping, or was it you just figuring it out on your own?
No, I had a lot of good guidance from the LCs that were there. They were always coming by. Whenever I would come over to visit my daughter, the NICU nurse would ask if I needed anybody to stop by while I was there, and I would usually request the LC. So they taught me some really great tricks for getting more milk out of my breasts, of course, how to handle for sanitation. Yeah, they were super, super helpful. So I didn't hire anybody outside of the NICU, but I had access to them anytime I was there.
That's great. Okay. And so then tell me what it was like once you were able to start doing some feeding practice.
So you start the feeds very gradually. I worked with an OT, and my daughter actually latched pretty well, but they can only suck for a few times before they get really tired. So you really have to build up this stamina. And that was something that was becoming clear to me. If I could spend more time here at the NICU, that would help her continue to practice this so that when she's discharged, she has the stamina to take pretty close to a feed. And they won't discharge you until they're taking 100% of their feeds through their own independent means. They have you make a goal when you get to that point of at discharge. Do you want your baby to have 60% of their feed from bottle, 40% of breastfeeding? To help you work with that. And I think at the beginning, I went with those ratios. I went with those percentages. And as we continued on with that journey, and I realized the reality of my life that was getting me here for the short spurts of time, and I wasn't able to make changes in my schedule to be there longer. I made peace with, I remember going to the OT and I said, we're going to change the goal. I want her to be on NeoSure, and she's going to come home on NeoSure, and that's it. And of course, I could have continued to pump, but I was pretty sick of pumping at this point. I was like, if we're going to do this, we're going to breastfeed. And I don't have the ability to really make this work here in the hospital to get it in a good place that I feel confident to do this at home.
And for you, the bigger goal was getting her home, not breastfeeding.
Yes.
And you couldn't spend enough time there to be able to practice the breastfeeding. If you had continued to keep that your goal, it would have meant longer time at the hospital.
Yes, longer stretches of time, which I just wasn't going to do. I wasn't going to be able to do. And saw how well she was taking the NeoSure. And yes, it made her gassy, but I saw the weight gain was looking really great. And I think when you see your baby be 2.5 pounds and you see them get closer to 5 and 6 pounds, you're like, I never want to see those scary low numbers again. I just want you to be as plump as we can get you.
Of course. I did have a question, which was, you mentioned with your first baby that once he was born, you had this feeling of disconnect, which so many people feel, but it feels a little bit taboo to talk about sometimes. Mm-hmm. There wasn't that overwhelming sense of, oh, here's my baby. And you equated it to potentially having that long labor. So you were really tired. Mm-hmm. And then he spent some time in the special care nursery. And this is really common, but some people feel like, what's wrong with me that I'm not having this overwhelming feeling of, oh, it's my baby. I feel like we've always been together. And then with the NICU baby, you mentioned she almost felt like a science baby.
Yep.
Yeah. So for both of those first two children, how long did it really take you to feel like, oh, this is my baby?
Oh boy. I think for my firstborn, if I'm being really honest, 9-10 months. A big part of that was the sleep. And I'm sure that experience inspired part of my story into becoming a sleep consultant. And yeah, I think I had struggled with some feelings of resent towards him.
Yeah.
For a while. And for my daughter, I don't know if it was quite as long, but it felt very different once she was home, of course, versus when she was still at the hospital. But I think it probably took several months as well to warm up to her and to really feel like, I don't know, just that maternal feeling. Of course, I always loved my children.
Of course.
But it was hard to really embrace that love of motherhood as well with them. Whereas my third, he came right out and I was like, come to mama.
Oh, wow.
And it was just such a beautiful beginning, a very quick and ridiculously painful third labor, but very fast. And I did get the golden hour with him and he latched right away and my breasts did not have any problems getting back into a rhythm with breastfeeding. And it was just a lovely, snuggly relationship from day one. So totally different.
Yeah. And it's interesting. We know that golden hour, that hour plus of skin to skin time is really good hormonally for both the person birthing and the baby. And so it's interesting that you didn't really get that time with the first two and it took a little longer to bond. And some people who still get that time, they don't feel that immediate sense of this is my baby. Sometimes it just takes a while and that's okay.
Hi, I'm Kanika, and you're listening to That's Total Mom Sense, the podcast, where I interview public figures on their life lessons in parenting, legacy, and built-in sixth sense.
Hey, what's up? I'm Kelly Rowland, and you're checking out That's Total Mom Sense.
Hi, this is Chelsea Clinton, and my experience on That's Total Mom Sense was fantastic.
It's me, Bobby Brown. Can't wait to share my story.
Thank you to my guests, brand partners, community, and you for making this show possible. Episodes released every Thursday wherever you listen to podcasts. You can join my tribe by logging on to that'stotalmomsense.com and by following me on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Kanika Chadda Gupta. Now let's dive in to today's episode.
Really, 3 times a charm. Like it was, I mean, of course I wished I could have had that experience for all 3. As a professional now in this field, I'm really grateful. I had all these different experiences because, when I see a mom who's just loving it and in it, I'm like, I feel it, I get it. And when I see a mom who's really struggling, I'm like, I get it. So it's very helpful to have had that sampling.
Yeah, exactly. Anything else before we get into how you support people that you want to share about that third experience? That time you did end up exclusively breastfeeding for longer.
Yeah, and I still did supplement probably around 4 months and then tapered off by 6 months. It was also coinciding with really the teaching schedule because at that point still I got all my teaching to be here at home, but I still had these long stretches of teaching and I can't just like pump in front of an 8-year-old. It's awkward. I'm sure I could have done it, but I think I was also just, hey, this is the best I've gotten. Like I'm happy with this, but I'm also
Yeah.
really okay with letting this go. And my baby didn't seem to, but his name is Oscar. He was like, okay, cool. We're going to do bottle. Cool. Okay. We're going to breastfeed. Cool. Okay. This is cold. Cool. Okay. This is warm. Cool. He was just like, I'm cool with it all, mom. And that kind of gave me permission, I guess, to say, okay, what would help with the rhythm of my whole family right now? Maybe letting this go is okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And was that a hard decision for you, considering that it was the first time that you really had gotten that good rhythm with breastfeeding, or did it feel
Really, I think also because I never had a very strong or long relationship or breastfeeding with my other 2, I guess it taught me of other ways to bond with them. And
Mm.
I was okay with knowing that I had other ways to bond with this one too, whether it was, and at that point we were doing a little Montessori floor bed. And so we would touch each other's foreheads when he would lay down and just kind of do that for a little bit, or I'd rub his back. And he's still a very snuggly little 17-month-old, but we just found other ways to enjoy each other. And that was okay that we didn't have the breastfeeding be a part of that anymore.
Yeah. And that was at around 6 months?
Around 6 months. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so many different experiences. And I love that you can use what you have experienced in your personal life to tap into what your clients might be feeling. So tell us what supports you do offer. Is it all in-person supports in the Boston area? Natick area?
Yeah, so I do in-person postpartum work, and a lot of times families will hire me for the cooking work that I do. I can do like a full cooking shift for them because food is a big part of your well-being and your being cared for. It was a big thing that I got to benefit from in my last postpartum. We actually host an au pair here, and she lovingly wanted to cook for me a lot during my postpartums. And my mom has come and cooked food, and that's just very wonderful to feel like that was something that was very cared for in the postpartum. So I like to do that for my clients. But a lot of times they'll also just hire me for just general guidance, and we'll meet for daytime shifts. Because of my sleep background, I always tell them that if they want to learn about sleep shaping techniques, I'm happy to practice those with their baby and with them in house so that they can see how that looks and what are some things that they can start to adopt. There's a lot of things you can do that are not sleep training at that point in their life. You could do all of them. You could choose one. Every family has a different bandwidth for what they want to work on at any given time. So I like to let them know what is the extent that they could do, and here are the steps you can take if you need to go much more gradually. I do a lot of just listening, hearing them talk about their birth story, or hear them talking about, especially a lot of parents hire me who are second and third time parents because they know they needed more support the next time around. So they often will ask me like, how do you do this? How do you balance this like multiple kid life and not lose your mind? So I do a lot of advising. And here in Massachusetts, we are going to be starting, a lot of major insurances are going to start covering some doula shifts. So I'm in the process of becoming credentialed with the Flourish Fund, which is based out of Rhode Island, which will mean I'll be able to meet with families in postpartum shifts for up to 6 individual appointments. So those would be virtual. So
That's amazing.
That's coming down the pike in a few months. I'm very excited about that. And then if families hire me strictly for sleep consulting, I do that as well, but that is just virtual. So we do a lot of talking on the phone, texting. I write a very specific sleep plan for whatever child's needs are. And I tell the families, like, I really aim to be holistic with that as well. So I'm not just thinking about the child. I'm also thinking about the family's flow of their day and what are things that they can do for themselves to work on their sleep.
That's so important. Yeah. Because I hear so many parents say, my kids go down and then it's my only time to be to myself. So I end up staying up till 2 a.m. and then I'm tired the whole rest of the day.
Right.
Yeah.
That
So
or
to be thinking holistically.
Or you've spent many years being woken up in the middle of the night. Your body literally doesn't know how to not do that anymore.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I can totally relate to that. Well, that's amazing. So the sleep consultation services, that can happen all across the country. Anybody can access you.
Yes, they
Okay.
can. Yep. Definitely.
Okay, amazing. All of your information will be linked in the show notes so people can find you there.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your vast array of experiences and for having just an authentic and open conversation about what it was like for you to navigate making decisions about feeding your babies in the way that felt best for you, for your babies, and for your family as a whole. Because sometimes there's a lot of shame and guilt that goes around that. And we all know that breast milk is amazing stuff. And it's not the only factor that we're looking at when we're trying to make healthy decisions for our families.
Absolutely. And there's never a cookie cutter or one or two templates of what parenting looks like. It's always a very complex web of factors for every family, for every child that comes into that family. And I love digging into that with families and helping them see that whatever choice you make is the best choice for you, for this child, for this moment.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If we lived in large familial groups like our human ancestors, or like some people across the globe still live in today, feeding our babies human milk would not be a struggle. But for many of us, that is no longer how we live. We have different pressures, different societal norms, different ways of living and being. This means that so many of us have struggled to feed our babies human milk with all of the other responsibilities that don't always align with the needs of someone who is producing milk for a baby. If you are feeling this tension of your life not quite fitting in with the way you want to feed your baby, and you need some support to navigate this, I would love to be the person to support you. I am pleased to now offer up to at least 6 fully covered visits through a handful of insurance companies all across the country through my partnership with the Lactation Network. Go to my website for more details, www.quadmemberservices.com, linked in the show notes, as always. Bye. Hi, Julie.
Hi.
Did you know that sometimes parents can't feed their babies their own milk because their work doesn't give them enough time to pump?
Yes.
What do you think about that?
I think of it bad and good.
Oh, yeah? What do you think is the bad part?
That the baby can't drink from the mommy and can only drink from a bottle.
Yeah. What do you think is the good part?
that they could buy cow's milk and feed the cow's milk to the baby.
Yeah. So you think it's good that they have another option?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think that workplaces should give time to parents if they would like to pump?
Yes, but no.
Oh, why?
The bad part is that they might force the parents to. And the good part, they might get them on the side.
Oh, so you think they should let them decide for themselves, that nobody should be forced to?
Yep,
I think that's pretty reasonable.
me too.
Great, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.